please do turn. And there we go. There's the robot telling you. Thank you very much for that. That's just to keep it as a historic record and for later. We are going to have a guest speaker who will then present the results of the survey. We have a representative from the Victorian Walks organisation, Jane Holroyd, who will be speaking after that, and then we'll have questions before the end of the meeting. So that's our format. We'll have the guest speaker present the results of the survey, a response from Victoria Walks, and then time for your questions. And we'll end the event. People are obviously able to stick around afterwards and discuss informally, but we know that your time is precious. So without further ado, I want to introduce our amazing guest speaker. Rhydian Cowley is a Moreland resident. He's from right here, and he is the best walker in not just our locality, but our entire country. He represented Australia in long distance walking at this year's Tokyo Olympics, finishing 8th in the 50-kilometre race and a personal best. He couldn't have peaked at a better time. I urge you to look up the time that he did it, because honestly, the only way any of us could move faster is if we were pushed off a 10-metre diving board. It is a real honour to have him here. He's a man not just with a passion for the elite sport that he is amongst the best in the world at, but a real passion for the environment and for walking in general. So please clap silently on your muted screens and give it up for our Olympian Rhydian Cowley.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thanks to the Brunswick Residents Network for inviting me to speak tonight. As I said, I live in Moreland, although I'm in far, far north Brunswick, up here in Fawkner. So I was training for the Olympics last year in lockdown with everybody else in Melbourne locked down. Certainly one thing I noticed training up and down the Merry Creek Trail was just how popular walking was in lockdown, and it really struck me that about just how accessible walking is, whether you're trying to do it at an Olympic level like I am, or whether you're just doing it to get outside, get some fresh air, and get that sort of real mental health benefit of being active. Certainly. It made me, the lockdown made me really evaluate what I like about my sport, because some of the things that I usually like about it, the social aspect, the racing aspect, weren't really available to me last year. And for me, knowing that I could get outside and sort of connect with the environment, and you can kind of see other people when they're out there, even if you're just walking past each other. So there was a little bit of that social aspect that I could still get. It was really important to me, and I think at that stage last year I didn't know whether the Olympics this year would end up going ahead. It was really uncertain, and it was quite uncertain even till I think pretty close to the Olympics this year. And knowing that I was getting outside and keeping active and watching the seasons pass, connecting with, like I said, the environment, listening to the Merry Creek and seeing the trees and whatnot, I found really valuable. And then coming back from the Olympics this year, of course, I had 2 weeks in hotel quarantine before I could go about my day again. I quarantined in Brisbane, although really, like, when you're in a room, you could be anywhere. It doesn't make that much of a difference. But certainly after 2 weeks in quarantine, I really appreciated being able to go outside and walk again. And I was pretty lucky, actually. The first day I went outside for a walk, I saw a bird of prey sitting in a tree. And one thing I've been trying to learn a little bit in the last couple of years is learning my birds a little bit more. So I took some photos and busily tried to identify it. So that was a great novelty for me. The thing, like I touched on before about walking, is that it's really accessible exercise. Basically, it's just what we do from when we're around a year old, and then as long as we're able to keep walking, it's one of the activities that we really like to keep doing as long as we can. And yeah, when I think we look at walking and accessibility when it comes to designing our suburbs and our cities, we need to think about not just people who are in that sort of younger male age group like myself that want to walk, but also how do we make it safe and accessible and easy for people to walk when when there's a family or when they're elderly, or especially if you have a disability. I think yeah, the accessibility and the concept of walking, or at least getting outside and keeping active, I think is really important in that really broad sense. And having got a quick glimpse of the report, I think it's definitely something that lots of people also value, is like that feeling of being safe and being comfortable walking. Yeah, it's and walking as well as I touched on in connecting to the environment, it's also good for the environment because, of course, it's a zero emissions form of transport. You're not burning fossil fuels like you are in a car, and when you don't require a bike, a bike's got a really low carbon footprint, but it still costs some energy to make a bike. So yeah, walking's really valued for that local accessibility aspect. You don't have to worry about parking your car when you walk, and yeah, I think it's definitely something that I've been trying to think a little bit more about in the past year and a bit with the lockdowns, about greater sort of meaning and value of walking, not just as a sport. And it's actually one of the oldest sports, going back to some of the professional days in like the 17th and 18th century, when people would have sort of betting matches about who could walk the furthest in a day or a couple of days. Sorry, just catching my thoughts again, everyone. Yeah, so I think it's been great to be sort of invited to talk a little bit about my sport and about walking in general. And I think there's lots of great insights from this survey, and I think it'll be really exciting for people to learn what the learn about what some of the results were and how that can be sort of applied, not just from in a policy sense from council, but also just hopefully what people can sort of reflect back on with their own experiences with sort of the pandemic and lockdowns in the last year and a half. And I'm sure that 2-year mark will creep up on us as well, and sort of what they would like to do in terms of keeping active and keeping walking, hopefully once things return to a little bit more normal. Certainly, I think for me, I've found a lot of positives from lockdown in terms of not having to drive as much and being able to walk a little bit more. And I think that's something that walking locally more is something I'd like to keep doing going forward. And I think, yeah, certainly if there's more funding for walking infrastructure in Moreland and in Brunswick in particular, I suppose, given that this is a Brunswick specific survey, I think that's something that will see a lot of value for people going forwards.
Rhydian, thank you so much for your thoughts. We very much appreciate it. What you have to say has a lot of resonance with people, even if they can't walk 50 kilometres in 3 hours and 52 minutes. So it's really great to get your perspective. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And I think we can all agree that those of us who've been doing more walking and being more active during this period, especially along that Merry Creek Trail, we can certainly look forward to seeing you there carving it up and preparing for Paris. So thank you again, and congratulations on your most recent wonderful achievement. It really is a wonderful thing. So we'll do another silent clap while we can. It's wonderful. Congratulations again, and thank you for being part of this. We very much appreciate you speaking tonight. I am going to hand over to Nancy to present this survey. The Brunswick Residents Network carried out 2 major surveys on traffic and how it affects residents in recent years, 2011, 2014. So 10 years since the first one, 7 since the second. The aim of this most recent 2021 survey was to find out when, where and how Brunswick residents walk, and to find out what could make them walk more often or enjoy it more or have it more a part of their life. So there's some really deep and interesting things in this survey, and Nancy Atkin, who coordinated the entire project, will now run through some of the key findings. Nancy.
Thank you, Dan. So firstly, we have to thank the 922 people who filled out the survey, which makes the survey results more valuable as we've got big samples across all of the 3 main Brunswick postcodes and for age groups from 18 up to 80. Our report is subtitled, How to Make Walking in Brunswick Safer and More Enjoyable. What we found is that both of these are crucial if we want to encourage people to walk more. And I'll just say the beautiful pictures that Nick is putting up here are by Ilana Rose, who is a local Brunswick resident. And you'll see them through my presentation. We asked a few questions of people about who you are, what Brunswick postcode you live in, and as Dan said, when, where and how you walk, what would make you walk more, the places you avoid, and priority danger hotspots where people feel in danger. So you can see we've got a stack of information to share. Our report also includes a list of recommendations for Moreland Council, and thanks for the councillors who come to hear about the report tonight, and 36 pages summarising responses to all 17 questions. You can read the detailed report at your leisure. I've been putting the link in to the page in the chat. And if you're interested, you can even go and read the hundreds of comments that people made in the open-ended questions. But tonight, I'll just start and mainly deal with 7 key findings based on your responses and focus on those. Now, when we talk about walking infrastructure, we think about building footpaths and safer crossings. And these, of course, are top priorities. But a crucial finding of this survey is that what people want first and foremost is shady trees. A clear majority of the people we surveyed believe more shady trees would make them walk more often, and a third chose trees as the thing that would make the most difference. Shady trees in our concrete urban environment came in first on both of these counts. And one survey respondent put their finger on it, asking for significantly more green spaces. For half the year, walking is just almost impossible due to lack of shade and intense heat. So the first few questions about when, where and why you walk, in these questions we were honestly surprised to find out how much people walk. More than 2/3 of respondents walk every day, and this goes up to more than 3/4 of the respondents in Central Brunswick, 3056. More than half walk for more than 5 hours in a week. Now, here's our first graph of the night, and thanks to Andrea Bunting for the fabulous graphs. As you can see here, people walk to parks, they walk to shops, to cafes, to the tram. So they're walking for both transport and for recreation. And as for reasons for walking, almost everyone gives health as one of the reasons for walking, along with issues of convenience, pleasure, and the environment. So I think the next graph shows that. Physical and mental health, the environment, and to reduce traffic, a similar response. Another surprise was that on this list, you'll see towards the bottom in dark green that 51% of people surveyed ticked "it's free" as a reason for walking. And this was most important for younger people. 3/4 of the 18 to 30-year-olds say they walk because it's free. And this makes walking and walkability a question of equity. Although we unfortunately didn't ask people whether they had access to a car, many wrote this into their responses with comments like, "Can't afford a car. I have a disability that prevents me from driving or cycling, so walking is my primary method of transport." The survey drew out concerns on 3 equally important aspects of safety. So that they are basically safety from falls or injuries resulting from poor infrastructure, safety from being injured by a vehicle, and safety from violent attack. And I'll deal with each of those in turn. Firstly, just to remind you, much of Brunswick consists of narrow streets with small workers' cottages alongside many new apartment developments on old factory sites. These areas have narrow and often poorly maintained footpaths. And in addition, unfortunately, developers have not been required to upgrade and widen footpaths when they bring in hundreds of new residents, even if they have got exemptions from car parking spaces on the assumption that those new residents will walk everywhere. Now, footpath quality, in particular, even surface, but also wider footpaths and footpaths clear of obstructions, is a major priority for residents. More even footpaths is a top priority for 35% of the people who took the survey. But for 71 to 80-year-olds, this response goes up to 60%. To quote one respondent, "Make the footpaths more even. So many are trip hazards. I work with people who are elderly, disabled and disadvantaged, and many of them have tripped and injured themselves." Having wide, even and unobstructed footpaths, like this beautiful new one that's been constructed just recently in Mini Street, will make walking more enjoyable and make people safe. This is a key area requiring council action. It's one issue where Brunswick is different from other areas of Moreland. A special program is needed to systematically upgrade footpaths, and planning rules need to ensure developers pay more through developer contributions for wide footpaths or shared zones in high density areas. The next picture is the north entrance to Berkeley Square. A second safety concern is fear of being run over. 60% of respondents say there's more traffic in their streets and more aggressive drivers compared to 5 years ago. These 2 issues are also in the top 5 responses on our question, what would make the most difference? Traffic speed is also a major issue. So in our open-ended questions, and thanks here to Annie Parkhill for sorting through the thousands of answers to these showed strong support for creating safer walking in residential streets by removing through traffic, stopping rat running and slowing traffic down, with many suggestions for stronger measures than those currently used, to include, for example, chicanes, road closures or shared zones, as shown here in the Fleming Park trial. Concerns about drivers included aggression, speed, and an ignorance of road rules, such as giving way to pedestrians. Some bike riders also cop criticism along similar lines, and older people in particular want bikes off footpaths. We asked a specific question relating to the proposed trial of 30 km/h speed limits in Brunswick. Would it make walking safer if traffic speeds in Brunswick residential streets were limited to 30k? Responses were split right down the middle, 49.5% yes and 50.5% no. This, however, may suggest growing support for lower speeds compared to our previous traffic survey in 2014. And we'd point out that older people and people walking with either children or with a pram were more likely to agree. The third aspect of safety, personal safety, or to put it bluntly, fear of attack, rates highest after shady trees in questions on what would make a difference. To put this in context, when we asked people when they walked, 2/3 or more selected daytime, late afternoon and weekends. You can see those all, all quite high, and mornings also quite high on the graph. but only 31% say that they walk at night, mostly from the 18 to 50-year age bracket. However, far fewer women walk at night. 43% of males walk at night, but only 25% of females. It's quite a shocking comparison. When we ask people to tick options for I would walk more often if blah, 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 with a series of options, 38% chose if streets were better lit, and 37% in the green chose if I wasn't worried about my safety. As you can see, these were the second and third most common responses, respectively, after more shady trees. And these choices were also number 2 and 3 in response to the follow-up question, what would make the most difference? And I think we've got another graph for that. No, we haven't. Sorry, oops. Okay, these high percentages are driven by women. For example, 46% of women agree that I'd walk more often if I wasn't worried about my safety, compared to 16% of men. And women are also more likely to prioritise street lighting. These results clearly show the fear of attack is preventing people walking, in particular women, but we should not ignore the 16% of men who state that safety concerns make them walk less. And interesting young people who are much more likely to actually walk after dark are very concerned about their safety and are much stronger in their call for better lighting. Now, you can see in this graph comparing what's better or worse 5 years ago to now, that on most counts, like traffic and footpaths, people think our walking environment is getting worse. But there is one bright spot, and it relates to perceptions of safety. Having more people out and about in our streets is seen as an improvement. 2/3 of people note more people walking during the day as something that's better than 5 years ago, and over a quarter appreciate more people walking at night. Those of us who get the tram home at night know the difference between getting off the tram when there's 8 or 10 people walking down your street compared to just 1 or 2. Now, to return to the shady tree. Trees are desired for their shade, an important issue in an era of climate emergency given their cooling effects. But just as importantly, people say trees are beautiful. They contribute to enjoyable walking. In responses to our question on places we avoid, these included busy, creepy, and ugly places. One surprise, and I think this will be of interest to the councillors and to the Sydney Road traders, was how many people avoid Sydney Road. And they gave a whole range of reasons. Listen to this. Sydney Road is horrible to walk along with its unwashed black tar, multi-patched footpaths, service holes every 2 to 3 metres, odd grades. I stumbled along Sydney Road as a teenager, and now I'm middle-aged, I'm still stumbling and picking up the elderly and the small as I go. Will I be elderly before walkers are considered as cars are in Sydney Road? Other comments mention cafe tables and shop stalls that obstruct the footpaths, air quality, and heat in the summer as reasons for avoiding our major shopping strip. There are a lot of positive suggestions about how to make walking enjoyable. Attractive parks and gardens, more interesting buildings, art on the street, and historical information. And I'll quote from one of these comments in a moment. Our report includes, excuse me, the 15 most commonly mentioned danger hotspots, and you can see the full list of hotspots also online. We asked you to take the time to read and consider our recommendations to Council. And just to whiz through these in just a minute, these include a change in perspective to recognise how many people walk for both transport and recreation, finding out how many people don't have access to a car and planning services based on this evidence. We recommend a systematic approach to footpath upgrades and a more ambitious approach to lowering traffic volumes and low speeds in residential streets. The report supports Moreland's tree planting and park development programs, but asks for more. Council needs to plan for innovative solutions to safety that will enhance rather than restrict mobility and encourage walking. And our report calls for housing densification to create a more attractive and enjoyable walking environment instead of increased ugliness. We'll be briefing council staff later this month. We're very glad they've agreed to meet with us on these findings. Here's one last quote. It's a real beauty. You may remember this gang from last year's lockdown, and this respondent did identify herself. She said, "I'm from the Brunswick East Entertainment Festival. You might know us from the performing we were doing during lockdown in 2020. There's one huge point missing to this conversation. People are attracted to beautiful places, places that feel nice to be in. Living on Nicholson for 5 years has taught me a lot. This street felt nice during lockdown. Why? Less noise pollution, less aggressive drivers. It was clear who my neighbours were. Only people from the local area were present on the streets, and they came out to the street because it was easier to be on during lockdown." And then we look at the aesthetics, how ugly Nicholson is. We must address the ugliness that unfolds, and that ugliness will repel people from engaging in the outside world. How can the streets reflect creativity and vitality and enjoyment and neighbourliness? It's a big question, but I'm sure that we agree that humans seek out beauty and we're capable of making places extremely beautiful and extremely comfortable. Nicholson Street is losing its soul. It's unattractive and appealing. Therefore, I don't want to walk on it. I want to walk in beauty. Now, just to finish, thanks to all the people who've helped. Some of you I've thanked just now, some of you I've thanked in the report. Nick, who's been putting up the sites tonight, deserves a big thanks for lots of stuff he's done. But there are also lots of other people here who've helped in various ways, and you know who you are, and we all know who they are, from helping to plan the survey, from leafleting the whole of Brunswick, a massive achievement, to reading drafts, getting up at 7:30 in the morning to go and leaflet at the tram stop, and much more. So thanks to all the members of Walk on Moreland, Pedestrian Safety for Nicholson Street, Coburg, and Be Safe Streets, as well as Brunswick Residents Network members who come together once a month in the working group. Thank you for your help and inspiration.
Thank you, Nancy. Please do peruse the report yourself. We can do mute clap as well. Please do peruse your report yourself. Some really interesting things in there. I think probably flip some of the things we generally think. For example, that shade and seats probably trump safety, which is probably not what people think generally about barriers to walking. And also flipping the thought we generally have around poverty and car access, with the car being a tool of mobility, which enables greater equality, whereas many of the people in the survey talking about the fact that their poverty or their age or their medical ability means they're unable to use cars and thus use walking as their primary means of transport. Thank you for that. The survey is there for you to look at, but just keen now to get Jane Holroyd on. Victoria Walks is Victoria's leading advocacy organisation for walking. Their community engagement officer and a Moreland resident is Jane Holroyd, and I invite her now to respond to the report.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks Nancy and Andrea and everyone else who's organised this amazing report. Nancy asked me just to talk about some of the things that stood out to me from this report, what makes Brunswick different in terms of what we know about walking across Victoria more generally. So the first thing I sort of noticed was just the number of people who responded to the survey, which I thought was pretty amazing, getting 900 people to fill out quite a long survey about walking. But in some ways it's sort of not surprising, because Brunswick is in many ways a really great place to walk, and I think probably a lot of people move to Brunswick because they want to live in a walkable environment. people who choose to move there, that is. So we know that, the inner suburbs of Melbourne, a much higher proportion of transport trips are made by walking. So an inner suburb like Brunswick, you'll have about 39-40% of trips done by walking, compared to the middle suburbs, which is about 25%. And then you get to the outer suburbs where only about 17% of transport trips are made by walking. So, and of course, what makes Brunswick a great place to walk is partly because it's quite a dense area. People live closer together, so you're able to walk to a lot of the things that you want to get to. There's probably also a lot more traffic congestion, so that deters people from driving in some instances. But of course, and this touches on some of the things that Nancy mentioned, what can be sort of more negative about living in some of these areas is the lack of greenery. So it's almost like you can move to the outer suburbs and have those, big green spaces, or you've sort of got to make a choice if you're, the good and the bad. Some of the other interesting things I noticed are also that people in Brunswick, according to your survey, walk a little bit more on average than people across Victoria and Australia generally. So on average across Australia, people say that they walk about 3.5 hours a week, whereas in Brunswick it's more like 5 hours. So well done, Brunswick. Sorry, I'm just picking out things that I thought were interesting, but I'm hoping that people will also ask questions about what's typical and what's not. So just with the trees, that is something that we hear a lot, that people really want more greenery in their walks, and that, I mean, we all know what it feels like walking across, a hot footpath in summer with no shade, and the difference that tree canopy makes to, it could be a drop of, I think it's about 15, sometimes even sort of 20 degrees in summer. So it really does make a difference. And I know Moreland has a really extensive tree planting plan and has really big targets around this. I think one problem is keeping the trees alive, which is a problem for all councils across Victoria. Just a couple of other things that stood out. Nancy talked a little bit about the anger about the state of footpaths, which is also sort of not surprising. You're in an older suburb in Melbourne, so with these older, smaller streets, so older infrastructure, but it's also actually not a concern that should be dismissed, because, and this is a statistic that surprises a lot of people, but trips and falls in the street actually sends about 5,000 Victorians to hospital every year, and it's actually a greater number of people who go to hospital as a pedestrian from falling than from being involved in collisions with vehicles. So that's quite staggering, and of course it has a much higher impact on the older people in our community who are incredibly vulnerable if they fall, or and that's, we often see a lot of concerns with older residents with shared spaces as well, so having to share paths with people on bikes and scooters, etc. Those concerns are much higher from older residents as well. Just a couple of other things. The people who don't drive, another thing that is worth pointing out is actually that the proportion of young people who are never getting their licence is also increasing. So that's something that's interesting as well, partly because of the cost, but also probably other factors as well. So the proportion of 18 to 21-year-olds who don't have a driver's licence is going up. Just trying to think. The other thing that was interesting, the point that Nancy raised about Sydney Road and so many people complaining about Sydney Road. I did have a look at Moreland's principal pedestrian network, which is what a lot of councils use to guide their sort of planning around walking. I could share my screen, but this is from 2012. This one was adopted, so I don't think it's been updated, but I could be wrong. But most of the sort of principal pedestrian networks are on our busier roads, and that's where council is tending to think that, you know, most people want to walk. So I think it's important, actually, the sort of work that this survey has done. I can't share my screen, sorry, but that's all right. People can look it up themselves. It's probably on council's website somewhere. Particularly, like, people avoid busy roads and roads with a lot of traffic because they find them unpleasant. So perhaps, you know, work that councils could be doing is thinking about alternative routes that people can take, and like the more pleasant routes, and what we can do to make and there was a mention in the report about permeability being so important, where when we're building new infrastructure, to really think about how people like to move through spaces, and how we can increase alternative options for people to get places, and not try and sort of force them to walk where they don't want to walk. Yeah, that's
fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Jane Holroyd from Victoria Walks Advocacy Organisation. Let's mute clap. Thank you, Jane. I do want to acknowledge that we are going to finish this meeting by 8:30, because I know that people spend a lot of time on the computer. I see that Deputy Mayor Mark Riley slipped in as well this evening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of the councillors and members of Parliament who are here. I just remind people that you can put questions in the chat. The report that we have been discussing, you're more than welcome to look at and examine, and you know, when it's available, put on Facebook. Is on the BRN website, the Brunswick Residents Network website. It's also in the chat. There's a link there, so you can have a look at that. There'll be an opportunity for more discussion of the report in the walking working group, which is in 2 weeks. If anyone would like to join, please contact Nancy or Nick. But we are going to have quick questions and comments. Nancy has thoroughly researched this field, and there's some really interesting insights in there. So please, either via the chat or by raising your hand for the remainder of the time that we have, please, you know, let's have some questions. And I will MC. To get us starting, because I know people are shy, there's a question from Mark, which I'll put to Nancy first, picking up on the comment about Nicholson Street. Wants to unpack what it is about beautiful versus ugly streets. So obviously trees are mentioned very much in the survey, but is it lower traffic speeds and volumes, or is it the actual noise generated? What has come out of that survey?
So I think that I think you have to look at the streets maybe one by one. So Nicholson Street has some particularly ugly buildings. The road surface has been given over entirely by the Department of Transport to trams and cars. The footpaths are terrible. And so I would think that's probably the mixture in Nicholson Street. Sydney Road, which is just even more complained about, hasn't got ugly buildings, or not yet. It's got beautiful old buildings, but there are different issues obviously there. And it's interesting that Lygon Street, which is a major street, people don't hate in the same way. So you know, so what are the mixtures of factors there? I mean, people mention noise, air quality, ugliness, traffic hazards, all those things. So I think that they probably all need to be addressed. I don't know if any of the other, I don't know, Jane probably may have more systematic ideas to this than I have as well, and might want to comment, or
we'll get to comments. Sylvia, I think, has a question. Sylvia, you able to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah. Thanks everyone for great presentations and everything. And my concern is that councils are risk averse in a legal sense in terms of having to give financial compensation when people fall, because legally you can make a case that it was council's responsibility to fix trip spots. And that is why councils do not encourage residents to report trip spots and don't provide an easy method for that to happen. Is there anything that other people here think might be a good way to, you know, get the legal department off the back of the people who are supposed to be looking after, you know, footpath maintenance, and getting the community to let council know where there are trip spots?
I'll just say that I think that obviously no one here wants to see those accidents occur, and obviously council spends an inordinate amount of time trying to reduce it. There's about 4 people on the chat who've been mayor who can probably speak to this. So Lambros is putting his hand up.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, of course, as Dan mentioned, we don't want to see people having falls on our footpaths, but sometimes it's just inevitable that falls do occur. But by all means, councils, I don't believe, try to hide it. We pay insurance, and quite high insurance premiums. So from my perspective, and I'm sure I speak for all of the fellow councillors here, we do want to see residents putting in a claim if they've had a trip. I guess the problem, I believe, here is that the standard in Victorian law is actually quite high. So it's very difficult to take legal action, and a lot of the burden or the responsibility is actually weighted more towards the pedestrian than it is towards the council. So perhaps this is an area of law that should be looked after, the level of maintenance, what classifies a trip hazard, and what is the expectation. So it is these elements that I think could be improved more to strengthen the approach. But by all means, if you feel that council is hiding how to make a claim with our insurance company, let me know. I'm happy to raise that, put it front and centre on our promotional material, because that shouldn't be the case. We pay insurance, we pay premiums. Our residents deserve to be able to rightfully make a claim where it's deserved and warranted. The only problem is, under Victorian law, it's actually so difficult to make a claim because the standard is so high.
Yeah. Can I also make a comment? I can't seem to put my hand up. Councillor Oscar-Gillis, last year council embarked on an organisation that actually went out and identified where those trips were in walkways and paths and footpaths. And in fact, it's cheaper to grade where the footpath's uneven, and that's been something that council's been doing, in particular around Brunswick, Pascoe Vale, even in Coburg. So, but I think Sylvia was right though, it is quite challenging for a resident to try and get compensation with the council. I mean, we do have our own processes, but of course we don't want anyone to trip. But I actually had someone this morning ring me up and say they tripped, and they're trying to find a way forward to potentially sue council. But look, we're conscious of what's going on. It's a massive cost to rip a couple of footpaths and just replace them. But I acknowledge what you're saying, Sylvia. It is definitely a concern.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to another question. I see Nick has his hand up there. Nick, what would you like to ask?
I wanted to flag, coming out of this, about the difference between Brunswick East, Brunswick and Brunswick West. And when you read the report, you'll find that there, you know, not only age and gender are factors about how people react to walking, but also which part of Brunswick. And the survey had, you know, more than 900 people responding. So I just wanted, Nancy, if you'd comment about that difference between the different parts of Brunswick, and particularly because of the different levels of development. I mean, Brunswick East particularly has got a lot of high level development, you know, big apartment blocks, big complexes being put up, and what that means for fixing footpaths afterwards for pedestrian access and so on.
Yes, so I think in particular, I have to go back and have another look, but in particular, I think people in Brunswick West were not so concerned about issues like rat running and speed. They weren't so concerned about getting 30k in their streets. I would think that probably in the future, as more high density development comes and more pressure of traffic, those views, those opinions may change. That they're probably where we were a few years back.
Interesting. Councillor Tapanos has put in a link in the chat for anyone who is interested in the process of.
Yeah, Dan, can I just go back to that thing about trip hazards? And I think that what we say in our summary and our recommendations to council is that there's a really strong response in this report saying the footpaths in Brunswick are terrible and something big, there needs to be a big program, not just a sort of regular annual maintenance. They need to be looked at much more thoroughly. They need to also be looked at in conjunction with the planning department, because we see a lack of coordination between the footpath people and the planning people, where people are making large or small developments around here and having a whole lot of exits over the footpaths, things they're not really supposed to do. And it's not clear to me why they're not knocked off earlier. And more importantly, as I've been thinking about this, I think there are all these developments in Brunswick where people are asking, and I've got no objection myself to this, where people are saying, well, there's lots of public transport and people walk, so we don't need to have so many car parks. But I think that developers need to be asked, as I think I said in my, as I said briefly in my presentation, these developers need to be asked to pay for the footpaths outside the developments as part of their responsibility, as part of their contribution. And if they're in a little narrow street, maybe that little narrow street needs bigger footpaths, or maybe it needs the whole street to be made into a shared zone. We need to be looking at what happens when those people walk out of those new apartment blocks, and the developers should take responsibility for that.
Thank you, Nancy. I think we've seen in the past year and a half that radical things are available, and things that we thought were immutable can be bent and changed very quickly. I do note our state member, Tim Reid, Dr. Reid, saying he loves the idea of getting developers to leave the footpath in better shape than before, and Councillor Conlon noting that he'd like to see increased developer contributions for footpaths. Given that we have pretty much every councillor here, we could probably have the meeting, but we will leave it for when there's there's probably some like rules and stuff involved. I don't know. There is a question from Tim Reid for Nancy. Much harder to plant trees over some footpaths on busy high streets. Do you think there's a need for shade cloth or verandas in those areas? What are we missing? We've talked about before in this report about busy streets. How do you make some of those streets are attractive and some of them are not?
Mm-hmm. And once again, the older buildings in Sydney Road do have awnings right across the footpaths, and yet when Bunnings put up their proposal for Glen Lyon Road, there was just a sort of tinsy little bit of awning over part of the footpath. I mean, why is this not a requirement? And yes, if there's you know, I mean, obviously in planning, what happens with the road space, the balance between footpaths and trees and road space is a difficult one, and yes, awnings must be one of the answers.
We've seen that radical change, and I think we can look at it most clearly in road space when we talk about the parklets that have been created, the push by the council to do to build and buy pocket parks and really change the suburb long after the development has occurred, you know, as it's going through this rapid pace of change. I'm just keen to know from the group involved, essentially, that we've seen these massive changes. People are living essentially more locally. They're spending more time in their locality. Is there a shift to view walking as essentially its own transport mode, not as incidental, but something that along with cars and public transport and, you know, these kind of forms of active transport actually is devoted its own space and time and money? anyone wants to speak to that.
Maybe if I could just comment, one thing that came out of the comments in the surveys was the diversity of reasons why people had to walk as much as chose to walk. And it was incredibly diverse, from young people who couldn't get a license, people who'd lost their license because of criminal or drink driving or suspended or whatever, elderly people who were now not safe to drive. And I think there's something that needs more investigation, and it's one of the recommendations of the report. Brunswick has a relatively low level of car ownership compared to many outer suburban areas, and that's part of the logic of the inner city and the public transport. But I think there's need for more research about how many people can access a car. Even if a household has a car, can all members of that household access it, and can they drive it? And because of age, because of disability, because of poverty, there was a high focus on a lot of people can't drive, rather than it being a matter of choice or preference. And I don't think there's the data, because of the nature of the survey in there, but I actually think that has implications. As Nancy said earlier, a lot of Moreland services assume that you can drive to drop stuff or do stuff, and that's not always the case for people. So it becomes an equity question.
We have a hand up from Councillor Conlon, but I'll just get to Caroline first before we finish up with James.
Thank you. Thanks for the great work on the survey, everyone. I just wanted to flag which was great, the coming explosion of outdoor dining, COVID driven, and just how that's going to impact and interface the whole walkability, footpaths, and what's council thinking about that. Thank you.
I think we have Mark Riley online, who is the Deputy Mayor, who could probably speak to that, I believe.
Thanks, Dan. I am listening intently. Yeah, we're preparing for that, and I guess there are standards on how far the disability standards on keeping clearance between the shop fronts and the walkways. So, for wheelchairs and other users, that's got to be complied with. So those kind of things are worked through, Carolyn, I think. And, obviously there's a lot of demand in some places and there's a fair bit of clutter in places. So it's important that those things are looked at and examined, and people give feedback to proprietors too if it's not working, to let them know and let us know if there are obstructions. There are a few A-frames. I know this is a local A-frame issue before a couple of weeks back, where we issue permits for those, but it turned out that A-frame had been sort of located somewhat a long way from the side street where it was directing, meant to be directing traffic or people's attention to that business. So there are all those sorts of things that need to be managed over time, but happy to hear back from people and get in touch with us if you've got concerns, and we'll certainly follow them up, because we need to keep them accessible and free flow of traffic. So while people can still enjoy eating outdoors for all the right reasons in COVID, it's really important to keep the pathways open and obviously repaired and upgraded, because we know, for all the reasons we talked about tonight, Brunswick is old and aging. So as Oscar mentioned earlier, we've been doing a lot of tracking of all of our footpaths to try and assess them in terms of where the higher needs are, the medium and lower needs, but so that there's been a request for more systemic approach, and we are working on that and developing that approach to get more of an attention where the high priority areas, to get the replacements happening sooner. Thanks, Dan. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I know James Councillor Conlon had his hand up, so I have to speak in probably haiku, given how up against the clock. Go for it.
Okay, I'll be 30 to 45 seconds. I was sort of just answering one of the questions beforehand about sort of how do we prioritise pedestrians, and I think this is what this survey helps to do. It really gives us a stronger sense, or a more in-depth sense of the fact that walkability and active transport, getting around our neighbourhoods, not just by car, is about social equity. Like you said, there are lots and lots of people who can't drive through no fault of their own, so they rely exclusively on walking. And then also the gender issue about walking being about safety as well. So I think I find this particular survey helpful in sort of unpacking that more. And I think if we can, I'm keen to see the sort of results of this sort of distributed widely, and hopefully that can help sort of shift that narrative more. And I guess I just wanted to make sort of a practical point about someone said that there's lots of examples of like mismatches or poor coordination between different levels of councils, like in terms of developments that are happening and things that are incorrect happening on the street. If those are happening frequently, I'd strongly suggest residents contact councillors, because that can be really helpful for us to keep on top of those things, because it's impossible for us to know everything that's going on given how much stuff we already have to keep abreast of. So strongly encourage people to let us know if you notice specific things that are not happening as they should.
Thank you for that, James. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to this meeting being held at outside a pub on a semi-closed street where I can buy you all drinks and we can walk home. But for now, Zoom is what we have. So thank you very much for this. People are welcome to come to be more involved in the walking working group to discuss this in more detail. Contact them through the Brunswick Residents Network. But please do read the report, share it, raise issues with your councillors and with the staff at council. Please contact Nancy or Nick if you'd like further information about drilling into those findings. But as we've seen in the past year and a bit, really radical things can happen to make a positive change amongst all the negative ones to where people live. Just by showing up this evening, you've shown that you are passionate about where you live. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. It is really, really touching to see. So thank you all. Good night and see you walking out on the streets. Just smile with your eyes.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.